This is not a demonstration of a 4-track, but I wanted to talk about recording in general, and what, if you're thinking about buying a recorder or a mixer, what size to look for. This is my Marantz 4-track. I bought this in 1993. In the 80s we used the Tascam 4-track, but this is the first one I bought. It has 4 inputs for recording, but it also has another 2 inputs which you can add to your recording or in the mix down. It has 6 inputs in total. But it's a 4-track recorder with a master. These are the 2 extra channels. So basically, if you have your 4 inputs, microphones or line in on these tracks here, you could add an extra 2 and you can pan them, bus them left or right, which would send it to certain channels. In its day, it was quite a sophisticated 4-track. Obviously it's cassette. It doesn't work because I basically played it to death. I used it so much that the band inside, I think it must have got stretched and it started to not play correctly. You can pan the different channels, direct, left, track 1, all this stuff. I mean, as I say, it's not a tutorial how to use it. What I want to talk about is that if you compare it to my Tascam 24, you can't really see it, but you know, size wise there's not much of a difference. I think in its day, well, I bought it second hand, but in its day it was quite a bit of money. On a 4-track, and like if you're thinking to buy a 4-track, an 8-track, 12-track, whatever, there's been a few comments, and I've read quite a bit about bouncing down, and on a 4-track we did that quite a lot, obviously. When I was at uni, I mean, the reason why I bought this, because at uni there was a 24-track and a 12-track, but you had to book to use them, and I didn't really want to work like that, to go in for an hour or half an hour and do your thing and then walk away. So I bought this so I could work at home. And in the end, I mean, I recorded an hour and a half of performance backing track, and I was bouncing down a lot. But the problem with bouncing down is that you lose quality, and you have to mix correctly. That's the other thing, because if you get it wrong and you wipe the original recording, you've lost it, you know. So you have to be sure of what you're bouncing, it's mixed correctly, there's enough effects on. If you get that wrong, well, you're in trouble. And that's the advantage by getting a bigger mixing desk. I mean, when I started out, right, I counted up all the instruments, because I used this as a mixer. I know the tape deck was defunct, but I used it as a mixer. I could put 4 inputs in, 6 inputs in, and mix all the instruments, and it was fine. Yeah, I mean, I had basically a 6 input mixer. It came out stereo. It's the same as this, it comes out stereo. But when I counted up all my instruments that I wanted to use simultaneously, I found out that this was not big enough. And it really depends on the music that you're doing. Because obviously if you're a solo performer, at most you're going to have a microphone, let's say guitar, or possibly a foot switch of some sort. Yeah, so maybe like at the most 3 instruments you can do at one time. I was learning about electronic music, modular music, so I wanted to plug a lot of instruments in at once, and at the time I think I had about 8 instruments in total. I've increased that, and as you can see on my Model 24, nearly all of those inputs are used now, transferring the effects in real time and stuff. But even so, that would have been a lot more difficult on a 4-track or an 8-track, because I did look at quite a lot of 8-tracks at the time, and I thought to extend it to a 12-track, which I probably would have got away with, but I splashed out on the 24-track. With these type of mixing decks, I mean, the advantage is the digital technology. I mean, it's an SD card. Here, it's a tape deck, yeah, but it's the same principle. You're recording sound onto a tape, you're recording sound onto an SD card. To be honest, the cassette, I mean, a lot of people don't have a good word about cassettes, but I actually liked them. They were very creative. You can design, the cassette itself. You can re-record really easily. You can cut the tape up. There's a lot of good things to say about the cassette in a creative way. Obviously it has its problems like tape snagging, sound quality, etc., compared to digital. But if you're after a DIY approach, it had a lot going for it. They were relatively cheap and easy accessible. You can do a lot more obviously with this, but in certain ways you can't, because as I've said on previous videos, is that when you record directly in, it doesn't record the effects except for the master. On my old Marantz, you can, and there's advantage and disadvantage with this. So if you put let's say you put a guitar in, there's no effects built in. You would have to have an external source, which I did do. I mean, I bought the effects unit at the same time as I bought the Marantz. So I had the auxiliary out coming back in, and so I had my reverb, and I could set my reverb level and it would record onto the cassette. That's a very easy way of doing it, and it works fine. There's less post-production. The disadvantage with that is that if you hear a lot of recordings from the 80s and 90s, well, let's say the 80s and 70s possibly, there's too much effect, because what you're hearing through the speakers sounds great in real time, but maybe 6 months, 2 years later, when you go back to that recording, I mean, I've got cassettes which are very hissy, too much reverb on, and because of that, the mix is distorted. And these were professionally done. These were like studios that you would go and do your recording in. It's not really a 4-track problem. It's a mixing problem. And whether you do it on this, like in real time, or whether you record it dry, or whether you do it on a 4-track, it's got nothing to do with the actual machine. It's to do with the recording, how good the engineer is. So yes, I mean, obviously you could turn the effects down and put them on later, which is probably the best thing to do, and therefore this is probably a better system then, because you can't record it. But it's nice to have an option to record it, you know what I mean? It's nice to have that opportunity to say, right, I want to add a chorus, and then later on to add the reverb to the whole lot. The other thing about this, around the back, if you look around the back, these white inserts, we have 4 of them. The input where you would put your microphone, or it's also got the XLRs here, but if you put microphones and line in, you have 4. The white ones are inserts. Inserts, it confused me a lot. in the day. I didn't really understand what inserts were. But basically it's like an aux send where, let's say, guitar comes in and this is directly sent out through the insert to, let's say, a fuzz box, distortion box, and it comes back in to the same channel. It's not an overall wash like you have with an aux send. It's directly on that channel. So the advantage of that is that you have a dry guitar going in, it would send to a fuzz box, come back in, and then you record it. It had them on each track. Whereas this, you have it only on 2. It has the inserts here. It's the same principle, but you have it on 2 tracks. Again, it's not a big deal because you can have your guitar going into your fuzz box and your fuzz box going into a line in. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just a different way of doing it. And in fact, in a way, it makes more sense to do it that way. I mean, but again, you have the option. There's options, you know what I mean? It's all, and I think that's when you start thinking outside of the box of what you want to do with it. What are the options available? And that's when you can be more creative with the hardware that you have. Because with hardware, as opposed to software, I guess there are fewer options than what a computer could offer. Another thing I wanted to say was sound. You might think because it's electronics, digital, that it doesn't have a sound. Well, in my opinion, it does have a sound. I mean, when I was using this as a mixing desk, it did convey sound differently to a computer. It's the same with this. This has a sound. The effects have a certain sound to it, as opposed to a computer. I find this more dynamic in many ways. You can do a lot of things with a computer that you can't do with this, and it's not about twiddling knobs, and it's not about doing faders. I mean, the hands-on experience, all that stuff. It's not about that. It has a certain quality and depth. I don't decry software. I think it's brilliant, but the past 10 years or whatever, I've been using software, so I'm getting back into the hardware. And yeah, there are disadvantages with it. But if you are thinking about getting a piece of hardware, whether it's a synth or whatever, mixing desk, you have to think in a different way. You do have to think in a different way. That is not a bad thing. That, in fact, that adds to, creating music. It's not so straightforward. There's more wires. There's more thinking about routing and panning and EQing in real time. Things that you would think which are pretty easy on the computer become a bit more complicated on the hardware. Because this has the capability of using as an interface, and that's really why I got it in the end, because I wanted more than a 2-track interface, a 2-input interface. At first I thought an 8-track, an 8 input, but then I saw this and I thought, well, why not have 24? Because you can use it as an interface. You can't use this as an interface. That's the other thing. Yeah, it's another reason why this wasn't enough. 4 tracks weren't enough. 8 input interface wasn't enough in the end. 2 or 3 years, you might be branching into a different, using effects on your guitar or whatever. You want to experiment a bit more. Perhaps you don't want to bounce down. As I say, it is a problem. If you get it wrong, you've lost the original recording. No, because this does have an opportunity. The sub is an opportunity of bouncing down, but there's, a big option. I mean, there's only one slider. You know what I mean? On some mixing desks, you get more sub sliders. So it's not catering for bouncing. Yeah, it's catering for direct input. There's always been a bit of debate in my mind whether to just use this as a standalone or to use it in conjunction with a computer. It was like 2 squabbling children in my head, because the interface on the Tascam, it makes things very easy. But at the same time, you think, well, why not just use a computer? Yeah, why? You don't have to transfer things over, just record on the computer. It's easy. But again, you know, it's the process and it's the sound. So this debate in my head, I finally decided to get rid of the computer out of the room. Yeah, it used to be here, but it's not here anymore. And I don't use it as an interface. I have all my instruments, mainly electronic synths and drum machines. They're connected all to here. So if I want to play 1 or 2, 4 or 5 at the same time, basically I switch them on, press record, and at least I have a record of it, a dry signal going in. If I want to edit that signal, then I can transfer it on the computer, do the edits. But this is a great machine for just capturing ideas. And I mean, obviously you can do that on a two-track interface. You know, it's relatively cheap to buy. It really depends how many instruments you're working with and what you want to do with those instruments. I learned a lot from a 4-track, and if you're starting out, it's no shame to buy like a 4 or 8-track. You can do a lot with it, and you can learn a lot about sound production and engineering. You know, 8 tracks, you know, it's affordable, really. To splash out on something like this is a bigger commitment, and maybe you don't need a 16-track or a 24-track or even a 12-track even. If you're a singer-songwriter, you just need maybe 8 tracks max. The interface idea is an interesting one, and it needs to be explored a lot more. You can get these like boxes, digital boxes, where it interacts with the computer, and that's a different thing again altogether, because you've got less gadgetry to mess around with. But as I say, that's not really the important thing, whether you do a slider or not. It's to do with manipulating sound, in my opinion. And I manipulated a lot of sound with this, with 4 tracks, with just these EQ here, with the effects, with panning, with bouncing down, overlaying tracks. You know, you can do a lot with just 4 tracks. And as I say, they're quite cheap digitally these days. I know a guy who's been recording a lot longer than what I have, and he uses a 2-track. Yeah, just a 2-input thing, and is produced many recordings. But he's just on his own with his guitar. You know what I mean? He just does his thing. So think about the music that you will be doing in the future, not the music that you're doing now. I have a manual for this, and it's interesting to read it because the Tascam doesn't come with much of a manual really. It's more of an instructional. But the Marantz came with a very nice manual. Here it is, the manual. 6-channel mixer, 4-track recorder, and it has, you know, compared to the ones that we get today, it has a lot of ideas, setting up, how to use all the effects, panning, all that stuff. I mean, there's ideas, overdubbing, more tracks. I'm going to put this online as well. It'll be basically just a video, and you can stop. It's worth reading, even though you don't have a 4-track or anything, because it has a lot of ideas about recording and how to use limited technology in a creative way. Make a video and link it to this one. I mean, obviously on YouTube you can find out all this technology, but in those days where information wasn't so available, it was a handy little book. So I just wanted to say that size is not everything, and you can actually do a lot with less. It really depends on the music that you want to produce.